Bellevue, Idaho, is a town of about 1,000 to 400 people, nestled in the mountains just outside Sun Valley. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where violent crime is virtually non-existent, where families move specifically because they want their kids growing up somewhere safe. The Johnson family fit right into this community. Alan Johnson had lived in the area most of his life. He co-owned a landscaping business with a partner, doing well enough that the family lived in a comfortable home on Glen Aspen Drive, about 4 miles outside town. His wife Diane worked as a tax collector at a medical clinic. They'd been together since high school, married for most of their 20 years as a couple. They had 2 children. The oldest, Matt, was 22 and studying at the University of Idaho. Their daughter Sarah was 16, a sophomore at Wood River High School, played volleyball, and had her own car. By all appearances, the Johnsons had built exactly the kind of life they'd wanted. What nobody outside the family knew was that by the summer of 2003, that life was falling apart. The Johnson household had become a battlefield, and the fighting was getting worse. At the center of it all was a 19-year-old high school dropout named Bruno Santos. Sarah Johnson had met Bruno sometime in the early summer of 2003. The relationship moved very fast, so fast that within a matter of weeks, she was spending all her free time with him. She even stopped hanging out with her old friends. Her grades started slipping. She became secretive and defensive. When her parents asked questions, she completely shut down. Bruno Santos lived in the Balmoral housing projects on the other side of town. He had dropped out of high school, had no job, no car, no real prospects. Word around town was that he was dealing drugs. He was also in the United States illegally, having come from Mexico with his family years earlier. By every measure, Alan and Diane Johnson used to evaluate their daughter's future. Bruno Santos represented the worst possible choice. But Sarah didn't see it that way. She told her friends they were engaged, that they were going to get married, and that they were planning on building a life together. The more her parents objected, the more determined she became. What had started as arguments between Sarah and her mother, Diane, escalated into what her brother Matt would later describe as constant warfare. The tension in the house became ridiculously unbearable. Alan and Diane tried everything. They talked to Sarah, they set boundaries, they grounded her. Nothing worked. Sarah was 16, and in her mind, she was in love and had found her soulmate. That was all that mattered. By late August, Alan and Diane Johnson were running out of options. They'd started discussing whether they should involve the police. In Idaho, the age of consent is 18. Bruno was 19. Technically, what he was doing was illegal, and given his immigration status, a statutory rape charge wouldn't just mean criminal trouble, it would likely mean instant deportation. But for whatever reason, they hadn't made that call yet. But over Labor Day weekend, 2003, the situation reached a breaking point. Sarah's aunt and uncle, Linda and James Vavold, had driven in from Caldwell to spend the holiday weekend with the family. They arrived on Friday, August 29th. That evening, Sarah told her parents she was sleeping over at a friend's house. Her parents were fine with it. They didn't have any reason to think she was lying. Saturday morning came. The Vavolds were up early, expecting to spend the day with the family, but Sarah wasn't home. Diane tried calling her, no answer. She tried calling the friend Sarah was supposedly staying with. The friend said Sarah hadn't been there. Diane and Alan started making more calls, trying to figure out where their daughter was. Eventually, they pieced it together. Sarah had spent the night at Bruno's apartment. Alan and his brother-in-law James got in the car and drove across town to the projects. When they got to Bruno's apartment, they found Sarah there. Alan told Bruno in clear terms to stay away from his daughter. Then he went further. He told Bruno that if he didn't stay away, Alan would go to the police and report him for statutory rape. He made it clear this wasn't an empty threat. For the rest of that weekend, Sarah barely spoke to anyone. The Vavolds tried to act like everything was normal, but the tension in the house was obvious. On Saturday, when the family went out to look at garage sales, Sarah sat in the car and refused to get out. She just stared out the window, silent. On Sunday and Monday, she spent most of her time away from the main house. Behind the Johnson home was a small guest house, essentially a one-bedroom apartment that the family rented out. The current tenant was a man named Mel Spiegel, an electrician who worked out of town during the week and was usually gone Monday through Friday. Sarah had a key to the guest house, so she'd often go there to do homework, to have privacy, or to get away from her parents. Mel Spiegel kept his hunting rifles in the guest house. One of them was a .264 Winchester Magnum, a bolt-action rifle typically used for hunting large game like elk or moose. It's a powerful weapon. The recoil alone is enough to leave a bruise on an inexperienced shooter. Monday night, September 1st, the Vovelds packed up and drove back to Caldwell. The Johnson house was quiet that evening. It was just Alan, Diane, and Sarah. Less than 12 hours later, Alan and Diane Johnson would be dead. The call came in to 911 at approximately 6:20 a.m. on Tuesday, September 2nd. A neighbor of the Johnsons reported that Sarah had just run over to their house, hysterical, saying someone had shot her parents. The neighbor called for help while trying to calm Sarah down. Blaine County Sheriff Walt Femling was one of the first to arrive at the scene. What he found in the master bedroom would stay with him for the rest of his career. Diane Johnson was in bed, still under the covers. She'd been shot once in the head, apparently while she was sleeping. The bullet had entered from close range and caused catastrophic damage. There was blood on the walls, on the ceiling, splattered across the carpet. Pieces of her skull had even landed in the hallway outside the bedroom. Alan Johnson's body was on the floor next to the bed. He had been in the bathroom, taking a shower, when the first shot was fired. He'd apparently heard it and come out to see what happened. That's when he was shot. 2 bullets to the chest, both also fired from close range. One of them had gone straight through his lung. He'd made it a few steps before collapsing. He bled out right there on the floor, less than 2 feet from where his wife lay dead in bed. The scene told a clear story. Someone had entered the bedroom and shot Diane first while she slept. When Alan came out of the bathroom, they shot him too. The killer had to have been standing right there in the room with them. This wasn't a shooting from a distance. This was up close, personal. The house itself showed no signs of forced entry. Every door was locked from the inside. Every window was secure. There was no evidence that anyone had broken in. Whoever killed Alan and Diane Johnson had either had a key or had been let in by someone who lived there. There were some odd details. Kitchen knives had been placed at the foot of the bed where Diane's body lay, and more knives had been placed in Matt's empty bedroom. Later, Sarah would suggest to investigators that maybe this was some kind of gang sign, that maybe she or her brother were being targeted. Sheriff Femling didn't buy it. He contacted gang units in Boise and Salt Lake City. None of them had ever heard of knives being arranged this way. It looked like someone was trying to stage a scene. That morning, Femling made a decision that would prove crucial to the investigation. He shut down the entire street. Nobody in, nobody out. In doing so, he stopped a garbage truck that had just started its route. The truck had already been collected from the Johnson house, but the garbage was still in the back of the truck. So Sheriff Femling had his officers search through it. Inside one of the garbage cans from the Johnson property, they found 3 items: a pink bathrobe soaked with blood, a brown left-handed leather glove, and a white right-handed latex glove. The bathrobe was splattered with what appeared to be high-velocity blood spatter, the kind of pattern you see when someone is shot at close range. The leather glove had what looked like gunpowder residue on the outside. All 3 items were sent to the Idaho State Police Crime Lab for analysis. It would take weeks to get the results back. In the meantime, investigators had to figure out who killed Alan and Diane Johnson, and very quickly, they had a theory. When family members started arriving at the Johnson house that morning, the first thing everyone talked about was Bruno Santos. Everyone knew about the relationship. Everyone knew about the fight that had happened over the weekend. Everyone knew Alan had threatened to call the police. To investigators, Bruno seemed like the obvious suspect. The timeline made sense. Alan had threatened him 3 days earlier. So, Bruno had a motive to silence Alan before he could follow through on that threat, and Bruno knew where the Johnsons lived. Sheriff Femling brought Bruno in for questioning. Bruno denied any involvement. He said he hadn't been anywhere near the Johnson house that morning. He provided an alibi, names of people who could confirm where he'd been, but investigators weren't ready to clear him yet. They took samples of his DNA and sent them to the lab along with the evidence from the garbage can. They were expecting a match. While they waited for the forensics to come back, they started paying more attention to Sarah, and what they observed didn't add up. Most teenagers who just found their parents murdered would be in shock. They'd be traumatized, unable to function. Sarah seemed different. When the coroner's office removed her parents' bodies from the house, Sarah stood outside watching. She didn't look away. She didn't break down. She just stood there on the fence line, watching as the body bags were carried out. Femling noticed it. He told his deputies to keep an eye on her behavior. Sarah's friends noticed it too. The day after the murders, Sarah showed up to volleyball practice. In the days that followed, she kept appointments to get her hair and nails done. At one point during practice, she pulled aside a teammate and asked her to find Bruno and tell him she loved him, no matter what happened. The teammate would later say that when Sarah said those words, something felt very wrong. At the memorial service for Alan and Diane, Sarah's behavior struck several family members as odd. She seemed more interested in who was attending than in grieving. She also asked if she could go to a volleyball game that evening. Multiple people overheard her talking about the life insurance money, saying she and her brother would be taken care of for life. She complained about having to stay with relatives, saying she wished she could get her own apartment right away. Sarah's grandmother, Pat Dishman, watched all of this and found herself thinking something she desperately didn't want to think. But the evidence kept piling up in her mind, and eventually, she couldn't ignore it anymore. Then the forensic results came back from the lab. Bruno Santos' DNA was not on the bathrobe. It was not on either of the gloves. There was no physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene at all. His alibi checked out. He wasn't involved. The DNA that was on those items belonged to 3 people: Alan Johnson, Diane Johnson, and Sarah Johnson. Sarah's DNA was found inside the latex glove, not on the outside, where you might expect it if she'd handled the glove innocently. Inside, where someone's hand would go when wearing it. The pink bathrobe had blood from both Alan and Diane all over it. The spatter pattern indicated that whoever was wearing that robe was standing very close when at least one of the shots was fired. When investigators asked Sarah about the bathrobe, she admitted it was hers, but she said she had no idea how it ended up in the garbage or how her parents' blood got on it. The right-handed leather glove that matched the left-handed one found in the garbage was discovered in Sarah's bedroom during a search of the house. So were 2 live .264 caliber rounds, same caliber as the murder weapon sitting on her nightstand. When investigators asked her about the bullets, she had no explanation. There was more. When Sarah was examined on the morning of the murders, investigators noticed she had a fresh bruise on her left shoulder. A .264 Winchester Magnum has significant recoil, enough to leave exactly that kind of bruise on someone who wasn't used to firing it. Sarah's hair that morning was styled in a perfect slick ponytail. Several officers noted this seemed unusual for someone who claimed to have just woken up to the sound of gunshots. Later, plumbers working on the house would find a shower cap that had been flushed down the toilet. The theory investigators developed was that Sarah had worn the shower cap while shooting her parents to keep blood out of her hair. The murder weapon itself was traced back to Mel Spiegel, the tenant who rented the guest house. Spiegel was interviewed and quickly cleared. He'd been in Boise that entire weekend and had an airtight alibi. But he confirmed that yes, he kept his rifles in the guest house, and yes, Sarah had a key and access to the place. Shell casings found at the scene matched Spiegel's rifle. Investigators developed a theory about how the crime unfolded. Sometime after 6 a.m. on September 2nd, Sarah went to the guest house and took Mel Spiegel's rifle. She put on her pink bathrobe, wearing it backwards to protect her clothes from blood spatter. She put on 2 gloves, 1 leather and 1 latex, possibly because she couldn't find a matching pair. She walked into her parents' bedroom. Her mother was still asleep. Her father was in the shower. She shot her mother once in the head. The sound of the shot brought her father out of the bathroom. She shot him twice in the chest. Then she went back to the guest house, returned the rifle, stripped off the bathrobe and gloves, and threw them in the garbage can outside. She went back to her room, cleaned herself up, and then ran to the neighbor's house to call for help. The whole thing probably took less than 10 minutes. When investigators confronted Sarah with this theory, she denied everything. She said she'd been asleep in her room. She heard shots. She ran to check on her parents and saw blood everywhere. She panicked and ran to the neighbors. That was her story. But her story kept changing. In one version, she said she heard arguing before the shots. In another version, she said she heard the first shot, went to her parents' room, saw what happened, and then heard the second shot. The details shifted every time she was interviewed. On October 29th, 2003, nearly 2 months after the murders, Sheriff Femling arrested Sarah Johnson at her aunt and uncle's house in Caldwell. She was charged as an adult with 2 counts of first-degree murder. She was 16 years old. Sarah's trial began in February 2005 in Boise. The venue had been moved out of Blaine County because of concerns about finding an impartial jury. By this point, Sarah was 18. She'd spent more than a year in jail awaiting trial. The prosecution's case was built on the physical evidence and on Sarah's behavior after the murders. They argued that Sarah had killed her parents because they were about to have Bruno deported. In her mind, the only way to preserve the relationship was to eliminate the threat, and the threat was her parents. Lead prosecutor Jim Thomas walked the jury through the forensic evidence piece by piece: the DNA inside the glove, the blood on the bathrobe, the matching glove in Sarah's bedroom, the bullets on her nightstand, the bruise on her shoulder, the shell casings that matched the rifle Sarah had access to, the lack of forced entry, the constantly changing story. The defense strategy was simpler. If Sarah had shot her mother at close range with a high-powered rifle, she would have been covered in blood, yet no blood was found on Sarah that morning. Her attorney, Bob Pangburn, hammered this point repeatedly. No blood, no guilt. Someone else must have killed Alan and Diane Johnson. The prosecution's counter-argument was that Sarah had protected herself. She'd worn the bathrobe backwards like a smock. She'd worn gloves. She'd possibly worn the shower cap they found flushed in the toilet, and she'd had time to clean up before calling for help. The trial lasted 7 weeks. It tore apart what remained of the Johnson family. Sarah's brother Matt took the stand and testified about the constant fighting between Sarah and their mother. Sarah's aunt Linda Vavold testified about Sarah's strange behavior after the murders, how she'd rolled her eyes when people were crying, how she'd seemed more concerned with her appearance than with grieving. Friends of Sarah testified about conversations they'd had with her in the days after the murders. Multiple people said she talked about the insurance money, about wanting to get an apartment, about needing to tell Bruno she loved him. One of the most damaging witnesses was a woman named Melinda Gonzalez, who'd been in jail with Sarah while she awaited trial. Gonzalez testified that she and Sarah had talked extensively about the case. At one point, according to Gonzalez, Sarah had started to say something and caught herself mid-sentence. She'd begun to say the words, "when I killed," before stopping and correcting herself to say, "when the killers." The defense brought in witnesses who testified that Sarah was a good kid, that she loved her parents, that she couldn't have done this. They brought in a blood spatter expert who supported their theory that the shooter would have been covered in blood. They pointed out that there were unidentified fingerprints on the murder weapon that didn't belong to Sarah. But they never put Sarah on the stand. When Judge Barry Wood asked Sarah directly if she wanted to testify in her own defense, she declined. After 7 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for 11 hours over the course of 2 days. On March 16, 2005, they returned with a verdict. Guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. Guilty on both firearm enhancements. Sarah's reaction was visceral. Her entire body shook. Her face turned red. She buried her face in her hands and sobbed as the verdict was read. 3 months later, on June 30th, 2005, Sarah appeared in court for sentencing. Judge Barry Wood had ordered a psychiatric evaluation. The psychiatrist who examined Sarah reported that he found no evidence of mental illness, no history of abuse, nothing that would explain why she'd committed such a violent act. He also noted that Sarah continued to deny any involvement in the murders, which meant there was no way to treat her because she wouldn't acknowledge what she'd done. Judge Wood addressed Sarah directly for nearly an hour before imposing the sentence. He talked about how she'd come from a good home, how she'd had opportunities, how she'd had options. He said he'd searched for some rational explanation for why she killed her parents and couldn't find one. The only motive that made any sense was that she'd wanted to protect her relationship with Bruno Santos. He asked the question everyone wanted answered. Why? Why would you throw away everything for this? Sarah didn't answer. She never has. Judge Wood sentenced her to 2 concurrent life terms without the possibility of parole, plus 15 years for using a firearm in the commission of the crimes. Under Idaho law, she would never be eligible for release. Sarah has appealed her conviction multiple times. In 2014, the Idaho Innocence Project took up her case. They focused on the unidentified fingerprints found on the murder weapon, which were later matched to a man named Christopher Hill, who had rented the guest house before Mel Spiegel. The Innocence Project argued this created reasonable doubt. The courts rejected the appeal. They noted that the jury had been aware of the unidentified fingerprints during the trial and had still convicted Sarah. The fingerprints alone weren't enough to overcome the mountain of other evidence pointing to her guilt. Every subsequent appeal has been denied. Sarah Marie Johnson is currently incarcerated at the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center in Idaho. She's been there since 2005. She was 18 years old when she was sentenced. She's now in her late 30s. She has spent more than half her life in prison. Bruno Santos was deported back to Mexico shortly after testifying at Sarah's trial. Whatever teenage romance they'd had was long over by that point. Sarah had killed her parents for absolutely nothing. The Johnson family never recovered from what happened. Matt Johnson lost his parents and his sister in one terrible sequence of events. His grandparents lost their daughter and, in a different way, their granddaughter. The family had to testify against Sarah in court, had to relive the worst day of their lives in excruciating detail in front of strangers. Alan and Diane Johnson were buried together in Bellevue. They were remembered as good people who'd worked hard, who'd loved their children, who'd tried to do the right thing. They'd seen their daughter heading down a dangerous path and tried to stop it. That decision cost them their lives. The question that haunts this case is still the same one Judge Wood asked. Why? Sarah had options. She could have waited 2 years until she turned 18 and was legally an adult. She could have broken up with Bruno. She could have run away. Instead, she chose the most extreme, most irreversible option available to her. In more than 20 years since the murders, Sarah has never confessed. She's never provided an explanation that makes sense. She maintains she didn't do it, that someone else killed her parents, that she's innocent. But the evidence tells a different story. And so Sarah Johnson remains in prison, where she'll spend the rest of her life, convicted of murdering the 2 people who brought her into this world and tried their best to raise her right. If you found this case as disturbing as I did, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more people find these stories that need to be told. And if you're not already subscribed, subscribe now, because I've got more cases like this one coming up. Real stories, deep research, no fluff. Drop a comment and let me know what you think about this case. Should Sarah have gotten a different sentence? Do you think there's any chance she didn't do it? Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.